Hey, AP government, wonderful people. Here's the second video, the installation for Unit 1. I put off making this video for a few days because I have the beginning of the year allergy blahs, but I'm fighting through today, and we're going to get this. So we already learned a bit about the ideals of democracy and the types of democracy, which we're going to continue to go over: participatory, plural, elite, so on and so forth. Today we're going to look at government power and individual rights. Now, if you're in my class, you already looked at some of the documents, various documents, to try to analyze where does power come from, who is power granted to, and were there any mention of rights and freedoms? So continue to think about that as we discuss this today. So let's go back in time to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And we'll learn about this more, but basically they're like, hey, these Articles of Confederation are a mess. We're going to completely restructure the government. We're going to be rebellious here and just create a whole new government, right? But how should it be structured? And we're going to learn about the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, because not everyone agreed with how it should be structured. That's why they were doing this on hot days behind closed windows with the curtains drawn, because they knew not all the people would agree with how to structure it as well. But there are some main concerns they had. How would representation take place? How would individuals be represented? What individuals should be represented? What about the states? How would the states be represented in this new government? Taxation. How are we going to tax? That was a big problem with the Articles of Confederation, right? That it didn't have that power to tax. What about balancing interests? When we had all these different states that had all these different needs and all these different interests from both states and people, how are we going to work that out? How are we going to delegate our powers? How much power goes to the states? How much power goes to the federal government, right? And how do we continue to balance order versus liberty? Now, we looked a little bit between tyranny and liberty, but remember, they're not exactly like opposites. So how do you keep order but also give people liberty? Where do you find that balance? So what they basically came up with was this federal system. And the federal system is what the Constitution created. You have a national government, a federal government, right? And that federal government, the states belong to it. The states have certain powers, but the federal government also has larger powers. So let's go back in time to see other ideas. Now, you've probably, if you're watching this in the fall of 2022, we've been watching a lot of the coverage with the Queen's death and the funeral. And it gives us another opportunity to look back at the differences between monarchies and democracies and constitutional monarchies and all sorts of things. So before our country, when there were monarchs, there's still monarchs, but you know what I mean. Where did their power come from? Well, people believed that they had divine rights, and that meant that their power came from God. And God gave monarchs these powers. And it was a unitary system of government. So think often one monarch is a way to remember, and that they granted certain powers then to the central government. Now, after the Glorious Revolution, if you learned about that in England, people started getting a little fed up and how much power should the king or queen really have? And that's when powers branched out to parliament and stuff like that, because they realized if you just have one person, even if this power comes from God, they can abuse this power, and that can lead to tyranny. So colonists were not granted representation in the British Parliament. And they thought that was tyrannical because then they were not represented. We're also going to look at a different type of government, and that's the Confederal system. So this is before the Constitution, right? After our revolution, we had a Confederal system that lasted over 10 years. So there was no president. George Washington wasn't president then, right? This was a confederation of states. And the power came from the people. And the power from the people was granted to state governments. States would appoint representatives for a national government. So in other words, you wouldn't appoint someone to go to Washington, so to speak, even though Washington wasn't a thing yet. The states would. And the national government was very limited, right? It couldn't just like pull up an army. It couldn't just send out all these taxes. States had a lot of power. Now, the Confederal system in the U.S. was not the only form of confederal systems in the world. Think of the Soviet Union, the Swiss cantons. Some people would argue even the European Union today is a confederal system. This was ineffective, however, in over here in our country because each state had different structures, and that made things difficult. How are you going to fund national things this way? One state didn't want to pay more than another. Some states didn't want to contribute to things other states did. It also leads to more class fighting because this system favored merchants, plantation owners, obviously left a lot of people out. So there was many reasons why this didn't work, and we'll go over more of the reasons. But eventually, we got rid of the confederal system, and we got our federal system. And that's what comes about. I should have showed this over before, but that's what comes about with our Constitution. Now, there's some things that are similar with the confederal system and some things that are different. With this, you still get power from the people. So when you looked at those early documents, right, where does power come from? The people grant its elected leaders the power. I'm going to discuss a lot the idea of we the people versus we the people of the United States. Okay, the Constitution is a federal document, which means it's really we the people of the United States, right? The first three words just happen to be big. We'll see where the people part comes in later. Okay, so this gave limited power to states and the national government, right? Some people who are really pro states' rights did not like this as much. The national government had expressed and enumerated powers. So some were specific and some were given. We're going to go over that if you're in my class after the multiple choice on the 15th and 16th, and we'll talk about that again. Mostly the powers the national government had were economic powers and military powers. So any power that the federal government did not have, states and the people then had it. And we see this in our 10th Amendment. So what did this federal government solve? It solved representation. Doesn't mean it was perfect. We might not agree with how representation happened. We know, like, for example, slaves were not represented, right? Not fully. So representation, it helped solve the delegation of powers. It helped solve balancing interests. We'll talk later about Madison and how he thought this. And it also helped solve the order versus liberty. Did it solve it 100%? No, we still have issues with this things today. But it vastly improved it from under the Articles of Confederation. And we're going to talk about some of the ways it solved things later. So if you don't understand all of that yet, don't worry. Just know that it did solve many of these problems. And then we'll talk about how later. Okay? Our federal system is often called the Madisonian Model, the Madison Model, the Madison Method. I've read. I want to learn a lot about James Madison. And James Madison was at the Constitutional Convention, and he took copious notes, and he came with lots of ideas. And he basically took those notes to help frame out the Constitution. Now, it's not like he did this himself by any means, right? There were debates. There was lots of contributing people. But there's some of these ideas that he supported, which we'll read about in like the Federalist Papers, that he believed should be part of this federal government that made it work. Some of these things we talked about already, like separation of powers, checks and balances, those ideas he got from the works of Montesquieu. Right? He was very much into federalism, that you need a strong federal government. State powers should be limited more than they were under the Confederal government. And also a big part of him is that not everything should be within control of the majority. It's not just if more people vote that they want something, that's how it should be. Because what if more people want to vote on something that takes away the rights of other people? Right? You need to protect the rights of the minority, which is another thing we're going to talk about. And when we say minority, it doesn't necessarily mean like racial minority. It just means of two opposing interests. Okay, so when you think of federal government, think of Madison as a big influence into its creation. Know that it solved a lot of problems that came from the Confederal government. And look at the difference between unitary government. In unitary government, their power comes from God, and here the power comes from the people. Now, we didn't talk yet about where your rights come from, which are similar in both those versions, but it's important to know where they believe they come from. We'll talk about that soon. All right, we're going to look at Federalist 10, we're going to look at Brutus 1, we're going to get into more about this federal system and how it works. See ya.